Hashtag his grandfather used to say that the smartest man in winter was the one who learned from a bear. Not the one who
Bring
tried
that
to
big
fight the
flat one over
cold,
here.
but the
This
one
one?
who
Yeah,
found
that's
a way to
perfect.
sleep through it
Set it right
warm.
there.
Thomas Brennan remembered those words as he stood at the mouth of the limestone cave, running his calloused hand along the smooth interior wall, feeling how the rock held the autumn sun's warmth, even as evening approached. The other settlers thought he was mad. He could hear their laughter echoing from the tent camp below, see the way they shook their heads when they passed him on the trail. But Thomas had survived 3 winters in the Montana territories before coming here, and he knew something they didn't. Wood burned fast, canvas tore, but stone, properly used, remembered warmth like a living thing. Western Colorado Plateau, October 1867. Thomas was 32 years old, lean and weathered from 6 years of frontier life, with hands that bore the scars of every mistake a man could make with an axe, a saw, or a plow. He had lost his wife Sarah to cholera on the Oregon Trail 5 years back, lost his first homestead in Montana, to a fire that took everything he owned except the clothes on his back and his grandfather's surveying tools. He had come to this new settlement with $47, a mule named Gus, and a determination that bordered on obsession. He would not lose another home to the elements. He would not spend another winter watching his breath freeze inside a cabin, watching frost creep through gaps in the logs, listening to the wind tear at walls that cost him months of labor. The cave he had found was shallow, only 15 feet deep, but it opened south, and the rock face above it overhung by nearly 8 feet, creating a natural shelter from rain and snow. The limestone was soft enough to work, but hard enough to hold. And most importantly, the rock was thick, 30 feet of solid stone between the cave and the mountain's peak. That stone would hold the earth's warmth all winter long. "You're building in a hole in the ground?" Samuel Pritchard's voice carried across the clearing, thick with derision. He was the unofficial leader of the settlement, a broad-shouldered man from Pennsylvania who had brought 2 wagons, 6 oxen, and enough lumber to build a proper frame house. He stood now with his thumbs hooked in his belt, surrounded by 3 other men who had stopped their work to watch Thomas unload clay from his mule. "Like some kind of animal?" Thomas set down the bucket carefully, wiping his hands on his canvas work pants. "Like someone who wants to stay warm." "Warm?" Pritchard laughed, and the others joined him. "Boy, you need walls and a roof, proper walls. That cave is gonna fill with smoke, trap moisture, probably collapse on your head come spring thaw. Rock doesn't collapse when it's been standing for 10,000 years, Thomas said quietly, and smoke rises. I'll build the chimney proper." "Chimney." Pritchard spat into the dust. "You planning to dig that through 30 feet of rock?" "Planning to build it along the rock face, outside the cave mouth, with a draw that pulls from inside. Same principle as a forge." Thomas picked up his bucket again. "My grandfather was a surveyor and a stonemason. He taught me a few things." "Your grandfather teach you to waste good clay making mud pies?" One of the other men called out. His name was Dutch Kerner, a carpenter who had already framed out 2 cabins for families who could afford to pay him. "That clay's gonna crack first hard freeze." Thomas had heard this argument before, had expected it. Not if it's mixed right, not if it's thick enough, and not if it's protected by the rock overhang. Protected? Pritchard shook his head slowly, his expression mixing pity with contempt. "Son, winter up here isn't like whatever soft country you came from. We're at 7,000 feet. Snow comes in October and doesn't leave until May. Temperature drops to 20 below, sometimes 30. Wind comes screaming down from those peaks like the devil's own breath. You need 4 walls of solid timber, chinked tight, with a good shake roof and a stone foundation. You need what every sensible man builds, not some Indian cave with mud smeared on it. Thomas met his eyes steadily. I've seen those solid timber cabins, seen them in Montana, watched ice form on the inside walls by December, watched families burn through cords of wood every week just to keep from freezing, and still wake up to frost on their blankets. Wood doesn't hold heat. It just keeps the wind out. Rock holds heat. Earth holds heat. And clay, mixed with sand and straw and applied thick, insulates better than any chinking you can pack between logs. You're a fool, Pritchard said flatly. And come January, when you're huddled in that cave freezing your ass off, don't come begging to share our fires. He turned away, and the other men followed, their laughter fading as they returned to their own building sites. Thomas stood alone in the clearing, watching them go. He felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing against his chest, the voice that whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool. But then he turned back to the cave, to the smooth limestone walls that still held the day's warmth, and he remembered Montana, remembered the Larson family, found frozen in their cabin after a 3-day blizzard, the walls solid, but the cold having seeped through every gap, every crack, every place where wood met wood imperfectly. Remembered old Jim Bridger, the mountain man who had wintered in a cave for 3 years and claimed he never once felt the cold cut through. The old-timers knew. Animals knew. The earth itself was warm if you knew how to reach it. He had 6 weeks, maybe 7 before the first serious snow. Time enough if he worked smart and didn't waste energy on pride. The next morning, Thomas began the detailed work. He had spent the previous week clearing the cave floor, removing loose rock and debris, leveling the ground with gravel and sand. Now he started on the wall that would close off the front of the cave, leaving space for a door and 2 small windows. He had sketched the design on a piece of birch bark using charcoal, a wall of stone and clay, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top, rising 8 feet to meet the natural rock ceiling. The stones he gathered from the creek bed below, selecting flat limestone pieces that would stack well. Each stone he cleaned, removing mud and moss, then set in place with a thick mortar of clay, sand, and water, mixed in a ratio his grandfather had taught him. 3 parts clay, 2 parts sand, 1 part water, with handfuls of dried grass for binding. The work was slow. Each stone had to be positioned carefully, tested for stability, adjusted until it sat firm. The mortar had to be worked until it reached the right consistency, neither too wet nor too dry, then applied generously to ensure no gaps remained. Thomas worked from dawn until the light failed, his hands raw from the rough stone, his back aching from the constant bending and lifting. By the end of the first week, he had built the wall to waist height and consumed nearly 300 pounds of clay. Martha Hendricks was the first person to visit without mockery in her eyes. She was a widow of 45, traveling with her 2 teenage sons to meet her brother in California. They had stopped at the settlement to rest their oxen and repair a broken wagon wheel, and she had heard the talk about the fool building in the cave. But Martha had grown up in Tennessee, where root cellars stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, and she understood about earth and stone. "May I see?" she asked, standing at a respectful distance from where Thomas was mixing mortar. He looked up, surprised. Most people avoided him now, as if failure might be contagious. "It's not much to look at yet. I'd still like to see." She stepped closer, her practical gray dress dusty from the trail, her eyes intelligent and measuring. She studied the wall, running her hand along the smooth clay mortar, testing the firmness of the stones. Then she stepped into the cave itself, touching the limestone walls, looking up at the ceiling, turning slowly to take in the space. When she emerged, she was nodding. My father built our root cellar into a hillside, dug back 8 feet into red clay. That cellar kept potatoes fresh until June and stayed warm enough in winter that the preserves never froze. This is the same principle, just larger. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, validation from someone who understood. That's exactly right. The earth stays about 55 degrees year-round once you get deep enough. This cave with the mountain behind it, it's like having a giant warming stone at your back. What will you do for the roof? The rock is the roof. I just need to seal the gap between my wall and the stone ceiling. I'll use timber beams to bridge it, then pack the space with clay and straw. Martha walked around the site, examining his stacks of materials, his tools, the careful way he had organized everything. You're doing this alone? I am. My boys and I are here another week while the wheel gets fixed. They're strong workers. I can't pay you, but if you could use the help. Thomas looked at her, this practical woman who saw sense where others saw folly, and felt gratitude wash over him. I'd be grateful for it. And I don't want pay. Just the company of folks who don't think I'm crazy. She smiled. Oh, I think you might be a little crazy, but the smart kind of crazy, the kind that survives. With Martha's sons helping, the work went faster. Ben was 17, tall and quiet, with his mother's careful intelligence. He learned quickly how to mix the mortar to the right consistency, how to test each stone for stability. Jacob was 15, stockier and more talkative, but he had strong hands and didn't complain about the repetitive labor. Together, they raised the front wall to its full height in 4 days, leaving openings for a door and 2 windows as Thomas had planned. The door opening was narrow, only 30 inches wide, to minimize heat loss. The windows were small, 18 inches square, positioned to catch the southern sun. While the boys worked on the wall, Thomas began constructing the chimney. This was the most critical element, the part that would determine whether the cave became a comfortable home or a smoke-filled death trap. He built it against the rock face outside the cave mouth, using flat stones and the same clay mortar. The chimney rose 12 feet, with a base opening inside the cave where the fire would sit. The design was simple but precise. A straight, vertical shaft with a slight taper, wide enough to create good draw, but narrow enough to retain heat. At the base, inside the cave, he built a firebox of stone with a cast-iron grate he had bought in Denver City before coming north. The grate would allow air to flow under the fire, improving combustion and heat output. "You're thinking like an engineer," Martha observed one evening as she watched him adjust the angle of the chimney's interior slope. "Most men just stack rocks and hope. My grandfather said hope was for prayers, not for chimneys." Thomas stepped back, checking the line with a plumb bob. Everything has to be right. The draw, the angle, the seal. One mistake and I'll smoke myself out or burn the place down. By the end of the second week, the basic structure was complete. The wall stood solid. The chimney drew clean when Thomas tested it with a small fire, and the door frame was set. Now came the critical work: sealing and insulating. Thomas mixed a finish coat of clay, sand, and finely chopped straw, adding a small amount of lime he had processed from heated limestone. This mixture, applied in a layer 3 inches thick over the entire interior wall, would dry hard and smooth, creating an airtight seal. He worked the mixture carefully, smoothing it with a wooden float, ensuring no cracks or gaps remained. The exterior of the wall, protected by the rock overhang, received the same treatment. When finished, the wall looked almost like plaster, smooth and uniform, a pale tan color that would lighten further as it dried. Thomas knew the clay would take weeks to cure completely, but it would harden enough in a few days to be functional. For the door, he had traded 2 days of labor to Dutch Kerner in exchange for a solid plank door and frame. Kerner had been surprised by the request, had expected Thomas to give up on his cave project. But he was a fair man, and he built a good door, thick pine planks, tongue and groove construction, with proper hinges and a latch. Thomas hung it carefully, testing the swing, adjusting until it sealed tight against the frame. He packed the gaps with wool he had bought from a sheep farmer passing through, then sealed the wool in place with more clay. The windows were simple, oiled canvas stretched over wooden frames that could be propped open in good weather or sealed shut in winter. Not glass, which he couldn't afford, but canvas would let in light while keeping out wind and rain. He mounted the frames on leather hinges, allowing them to swing inward, and created wooden shutters that could be closed over them from inside for extra insulation. October faded into November. The aspens on the mountainside turned gold, then dropped their leaves in a single week of hard wind. The morning temperature dropped below freezing. Other settlers finished their cabins, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, laid in their firewood. Thomas watched them work, saw the solid construction, the careful craftsmanship, and still felt certain he had chosen right. He spent the 3rd week building furniture and installing the finishing touches. A bed frame of pine poles lashed together with rope, raised a foot off the ground to avoid the coldest air. A table and 2 chairs, simple but sturdy. Shelves carved into the limestone wall where the stone was soft enough to work. A food storage area in the deepest part of the cave, where the temperature would stay most constant. He dug a small pit near the back wall and lined it with stones, creating a cold storage that would function like an icebox, using the earth's natural coolness. The firebox became the heart of the home. Thomas built a stone apron in front of it, creating a cooking area where he could set pots directly on the coals. He fashioned a simple crane from iron rod, allowing him to swing pots in and out of the fire. Above the firebox, he built a stone shelf that would radiate heat into the room long after the fire died down. Every element was designed for efficiency, for maximum heat retention and minimal fuel consumption. Martha and her sons left in mid-November, the wagon wheel repaired, the oxen rested. Before they departed, Martha pressed a small bag into Thomas's hand. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, corn. "For spring," she said, "when you've proven everyone wrong and you're still here." Thomas watched them roll away down the valley trail, feeling the weight of solitude return. But it was a different solitude now, less desperate. He had built something real, something that would work. The first test came on November 18th. Thomas woke to silence, that peculiar muffled quiet that meant snow. He opened the door to find 8 inches of white covering the ground, still falling steadily from a gray sky. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. He built up the fire, adding 2 logs to the coals, and settled in to wait out the storm. By afternoon, the snow was 14 inches deep. The wind had picked up, gusting to 30 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontal across the clearing. Thomas could hear it battering the canvas tents down in the main camp, could imagine the settlers huddled around their fires, burning through their wood supplies, feeling the cold seep through every crack and gap. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 68 degrees. The fire burned steadily, the chimney drawing perfectly, the smoke rising clean and fast. The thick walls blocked the wind completely. No drafts, no cold spots, no ice forming on the interior surfaces. The limestone walls actually felt warm to the touch, radiating the heat from the fire back into the space. Thomas sat at his table, eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, listening to the storm rage outside, and felt a deep satisfaction. It was working exactly as he had planned. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, Thomas emerged to find 2 feet of snow covering everything. The settlement looked battered. Several tents had collapsed under the snow's weight. One cabin's roof had partially caved in. People moved slowly, exhausted from 3 days of constant fire tending and cold. Thomas walked down to the main camp to check on folks, to offer help if needed. Pritchard was there, looking haggard. His cabin stood solid, but Thomas could see the strain in his face. "How'd you fare?" Pritchard asked, his tone less hostile than before. "Stayed warm," Thomas said simply. "Fire burned steady. No problems." "How much wood you go through?" "Maybe a quarter cord for the 3 days." Pritchard stared at him. "Quarter cord? I burned near 2 cords. Had to get up every 2 hours to feed the fire, or the place would have gotten cold." "Rock holds the heat," Thomas said. "Once the walls warm up, they stay warm. Don't need as much fire." Other settlers were listening now, their expressions shifting from skepticism to curiosity. Dutch Kerner stepped forward. "You saying that cave stayed warm through that storm?" 65 to 70 degrees the whole time. Comfortable enough I didn't need more than 1 blanket. "I'll be damned," Kerner said softly. "Maybe you're not as crazy as we thought." But the real test was still coming. The November storm was just a preview. December brought cold that settled in and stayed, pushing the temperature down to 5 below zero, then 10 below. The wind was relentless, screaming down from the peaks day and night, finding every weakness in every structure. Settlers burned through their wood supplies faster than expected. Families doubled up, sharing cabins to conserve heat and fuel. Hunting became difficult as game moved to lower elevations. The mood in the settlement turned grim. Thomas continued his routine, burning a small fire morning and evening, letting it die to coals overnight. The cave stayed comfortable. He had hung a thermometer on the wall, a luxury purchased in Denver City, and he checked it religiously. The temperature never dropped below 60 degrees, even on the coldest nights. The limestone walls had absorbed so much heat from the autumn sun and the daily fires that they radiated warmth constantly. He could place his hand flat against the stone and feel it. A gentle, steady heat that never faded. On December 23rd, the sky turned the color of old iron. The wind died completely, leaving an eerie stillness. Thomas had seen this before, in Montana. The calm before the worst storm. He spent the day gathering extra firewood, checking his supplies, sealing every possible gap. He filled every container with water from the creek before it froze solid. He brought in extra food from his outdoor cache. Then he settled in to wait. The blizzard hit at midnight. Thomas woke to a roar like a freight train, the wind hammering against the mountain with a force that made the ground tremble. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by winds that would later be estimated at 70 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The storm was a living thing, a monster that wanted to kill everything exposed to it. Inside the cave, Thomas sat by his fire and listened. The wind couldn't reach him. The rock absorbed its fury, turned it aside, left him in an island of calm. He added wood to the fire, not because he needed to, but because the light was comforting. The flames danced, the shadows moved on the limestone walls, and the temperature held steady at 67 degrees. The storm raged for 2 days. On the second day, Thomas heard pounding on his door. He opened it to find Pritchard and his wife standing in the howling wind, wrapped in blankets, their faces gray with cold. Behind them, barely visible through the driving snow, 2 more figures struggled toward the cave. "Our cabin's failing," Pritchard shouted over the wind. "Roof's coming apart. We need shelter." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Get inside, all of you." They came in like refugees from a war. Pritchard and his wife Helen, Dutch Kerner and his teenage daughter Anna. All 4 were shaking violently, their clothes crusted with ice, their faces showing the early stages of frostbite. Thomas got them close to the fire, wrapped them in his blankets, heated water for tea. Slowly, the shaking subsided. Color returned to their faces. They looked around the cave with wonder. "It's warm," Helen Pritchard said, her voice breaking. "It's actually warm." "How is this possible?" Kerner asked. He stood up, walked to the wall, placed both hands against the stone. "The wall is warm." "How?" "The mountain is warm," Thomas said. "The earth is warm. I just built a way to keep that warmth in and the cold out." They stayed for 3 days, the 5 of them crowded into the small space. Thomas shared his food, his blankets, his fire. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside they were safe. They talked during the long hours, the conversation moving from awkward to genuine. Pritchard told stories of Pennsylvania, of the farm he'd left behind. Kerner talked about his wife, dead 2 years from pneumonia, about raising Anna alone. Helen Pritchard, a quiet woman who rarely spoke in public, revealed a sharp wit and a gift for storytelling. Anna, 16 and shy, slowly opened up about her dreams of becoming a teacher. On the 3rd night, as the wind finally began to subside, Pritchard looked at Thomas across the fire. "I was wrong about you. I'm man enough to say it. This cave, this design, it's brilliant. You tried to tell us, and we mocked you." "You didn't know," Thomas said. "Most people don't. They build what they've always built, what their fathers built, without asking if it's the best way." "Will you teach me?" Kerner asked. "How to do this. I've got a brother coming in spring with his family. I want to build them something like this." "I'll teach anyone who wants to learn," Thomas said. "It's not complicated. It just requires thinking different." When the storm finally broke, they emerged to devastation. 3 cabins had lost their roofs. 2 had burned down when desperate families overfired their stoves trying to stay warm. The tent camp was completely destroyed, and there were casualties. Old man Hendricks, no relation to Martha, had frozen to death in his cabin when his fire went out, and he was too weak to restart it. The Johnson baby, only 6 months old, had died from the cold despite her parents' desperate efforts. The settlement gathered in the ruins, counting their losses, taking stock. 27 people had survived, but the cost was high. Food supplies were depleted. Firewood was running dangerously low. Morale was shattered, and winter was only half over. Thomas stood before them, his voice quiet but carrying. "I know how to build shelters that will keep you warm. I know how to make it through winter without burning all your wood. It's not too late. We can modify your existing cabins, or we can build new ones into the hillside, but you have to trust the method. You have to work with the earth, not against it." There was silence. Then Pritchard stepped forward. "I trust him. He saved our lives. I'll do whatever he says." "Same," Kerner said. "I've seen it work." One by one, the others nodded. They were desperate, exhausted, and frightened, but they were also pragmatic. Thomas had proven his method in the worst possible test. They would be fools not to listen now. The next 6 weeks were a frenzy of activity. Thomas organized the settlers into work crews, teaching them as they built. They couldn't construct full cave dwellings in winter, but they could modify existing structures. They dug into the hillsides behind cabins, extending them back into the earth. They added thick clay insulation to existing walls. They rebuilt failed chimneys using Thomas's design. They created double wall systems, packing the space between with sand and straw. The results were immediate. Cabins that had been frigid became comfortable. Families that had been burning 2 cords of wood a week cut their consumption in half. The settlement stabilized. People stopped just surviving and started living again. Thomas worked 18-hour days, moving from site to site, teaching, demonstrating, solving problems. His hands bled from the constant work with clay and stone. His voice grew hoarse from explaining the same principles over and over. But he kept going, driven by the memory of those who had died, determined that no one else would freeze. In late February, a supply train arrived from Denver City, bringing mail and news. Among the letters was one for Thomas, forwarded from Montana. It was from Martha Hendricks. She and her sons had reached California safely, had found her brother, were settling in. But she had heard about the Christmas blizzard, had worried about him. "I pray this finds you well and warm," she wrote. "I knew your cave would work. I told everyone here about it. My brother wants to know more. He's planning to build similar shelters for his workers. Would you consider coming to California to teach the method?" Thomas read the letter twice, standing in the weak February sunlight outside his cave. California. A new start. Good pay, probably. Recognition for his work. But he looked around at the settlement, at the modified cabins, at the people who had learned to trust him. They would need him through the spring, through the building season. There would be new settlers arriving, people who would need to learn. The work wasn't finished here. He wrote back that night, by firelight. His response simple and honest. He would stay through the summer, help establish the settlement properly. But in the fall, if the offer still stood, he would come to California. He had learned something important. Knowledge was meant to be shared. His grandfather's wisdom about working with nature instead of against it, about learning from the bear, about understanding that the earth itself was warm if you knew how to reach it. This wasn't just for him. It was for anyone willing to listen, willing to think different, willing to look foolish before being proven right. Spring came late, but welcome. The snow melted slowly, revealing a landscape transformed. The settlement had survived. More than survived. It had adapted, evolved, become stronger. When new settlers arrived in May, they found not a struggling camp, but a thriving community with innovative shelters and hard-won wisdom. Thomas spent the summer teaching, building, refining his methods. He documented everything in careful drawings and notes, creating a manual that others could follow. He trained Kerner and Pritchard and 3 others to become builders themselves, capable of teaching the next wave of settlers. He built 2 more cave dwellings, demonstrating different variations of the design for different situations. In September, as the aspens turned gold again, Thomas packed his tools and prepared to leave for California. The settlement threw him a farewell dinner, a simple affair of venison stew and sourdough bread. But the gratitude was genuine. Pritchard made a speech, his voice rough with emotion. "You came here alone, with an idea we all mocked. You could have given up, could have built what we told you to build, but you trusted your knowledge, trusted your grandfather's wisdom. And when the worst came, when we were dying, you saved us. You didn't say, "I told you so." You just taught us. That's the mark of a real teacher, a real leader. We won't forget. Thomas left the next morning, riding Gus down the valley trail toward Denver City and the stage that would take him west. He looked back once at the settlement, at the cave dwelling that had started it all, at the modified cabins and new construction spreading across the hillside. The smoke from morning fires rose straight into the calm air. People were moving about their work, secure in their homes, ready for the winter to come. His grandfather had been right. The smartest man in winter was the one who learned from the bear, who understood that nature wasn't an enemy to be fought, but a teacher to be studied. The earth was warm, the stone held heat, and a man who worked with these truths instead of against them could not only survive but thrive, could build something lasting, could help others do the same. Thomas turned Gus west and rode toward the future, carrying his grandfather's wisdom forward to new places, new people, new challenges. Behind him, the cave dwelling stood silent and solid, built into the mountain's embrace, a testament to the power of thinking different, of trusting knowledge over convention, of having the courage to look foolish until the moment you're proven right. The winter would come again, as it always did, but the people would be ready. They had learned, and that learning would spread, shelter by shelter, settlement by settlement, carried forward by those willing to listen, willing to build not against nature, but with it, willing to understand that the greatest strength sometimes came from yielding to the earth's ancient warmth rather than fighting the cold with walls that could never be thick enough, fires that could never burn bright enough, pride that could never keep anyone warm.